The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 5. As Aide de Camp. In spite of the way in which the fight at Great Meadows came to an end, Governor Dinwiddie made up his mind that the troops, led by Washington, should cross the hills and drive the French from Fort Duquesne. Washington thought it a wild scheme, for the snow lay deep on the hills. His men were worn out and had no arms, nor tents, nor clothes, nor food, such as would fit them to take the field. It would need gold to buy these things, as well as to pay for fresh troops. Gold was placed in the governor's hands to use as he pleased. Our force was spread out into 10 bands of 100 men each. The King's troops were put in high rank, and Colonel Washington was made captain. This, of course, was more than he could bear, so he left the army at once, and with a sad heart. In a short time Governor Sharp of Maryland was placed by King George at the head of all the force that was to fight the French. He knew that he would need the aid of Washington, and he begged him to come back and serve with him in the field. But Washington did not like the terms, and paid no heed to the call. The next spring General Braddock came from England with 2 large bands of well trained troops, which it was thought would drive the French back into Canada. Our men were full of joy, and thought the war would soon be at an end. Braddock urged Washington to join him in the field. Washington felt that he could be of great use, as he knew the land and the ways of red men. So he took up the sword once more as Braddock's aide de camp. Benjamin Franklin, who had charge of the mails, lent his aid to the cause, and did all that he could to serve Braddock and his men. Braddock, with his staff and guard of horsemen, set out for Will's Creek by the way of Winchester in April, 1755. He rode in a fine turn out that he had bought of Governor Sharp, which he soon found out was not meant for use on rough roads. But he had fought with dukes and men of high rank, and was fond of show, and liked to put on a great deal of style. He thought that this would make the troops look up to him, and would add much to his fame. In May the troops went into camp, and Washington had a chance to learn much of the art of war that was new and strange to him, and to see some things that made him smile. All the rules and forms of camp life were kept up. One of the head men who died while in camp was borne to the grave in this style. A guard marched in front of the corpse, the captain of it in the rear. Each man held his gun upside down, as a sign that the dead would war no more, and the drums beat the dead march. When near the grave, the guard formed 2 lines that stood face to face, let their guns rest on the ground, and leaned their heads on the butts. The corpse was borne twixt these 2 rows of men, with the sword and sash on the top of the box in which he lay, and in the rear of it the men of rank marched 2 and 2. When the corpse was put in the ground, the guard fired their guns 3 times, and then all the troops marched back to camp. The red men, the Delawares and the Shawnees, came to aid General Braddock. With them were White Thunder, who had charge of the speech belts, and Silver Heels, who was swift of foot. Half King was dead, and White Thunder reigned in his stead. The red men had a camp to themselves, where they would sing and dance and howl and yell for half the night. It was fun for the King's troops to watch them at their sports and games, and they soon found a great charm in the wild sort of life. In the daytime the red men and their squaws, rigged up in their plumes and war paint, hung round Braddock's camp and gazed spellbound at the troops as they went through their drills. But this state of things did not last long, and strife rose twixt the red and white men, and some of the redskins left the camp. They told Braddock they would meet him on his march, but they did not keep their word. Washington was sent to Williamsburg to bring the gold of which there was need, and when he came back he found that Braddock had left a small guard at Fort Cumberland on Will's Creek, and was then on his way to Fort Duquesne. He would give no heed to those who knew more of the backwoods than he did, nor call on the red men to serve as scouts and guides. He was not used to that kind of warfare, and scorned to be taught by such a youth as George Washington. The march was a hard one for man and beast. Up steep hills and through rough roads they had to drag the guns, and Braddock soon found out that these new fields were not like the ones on which he had been wont to fight. Hard as it was for his pride to seek the aid of so young a man, he was at last forced to ask Washington to help him out of these straits. They had then made a halt at Little Meadows. Washington said there was no time to lose. They must push on at once. While at this place, Captain Jack and his brave band of huntsmen came into camp. They were fond of the chase, and were well armed with knives and guns, and looked quite like a tribe of red skins as they came out of the wood. Braddock met them in a stiff sort of way. Captain Jack stepped in front of his band and said that he and his men were used to rough work, and knew how to deal with the red men, and would be glad to join the force. Braddock looked on him with a gaze of scorn, and spoke to him in a way that roused the ire of Captain Jack. He told his men what had been said, and the whole band turned their backs on the camp, and went through the woods to their old haunts, where they were known and prized at their true worth. In the meantime, Washington, who had had a headache for some days, grew so ill that he could not ride on his horse, and had to be borne part of the time in a cart. Braddock, who knew well what a loss his death would be, said that he should not go on. Washington pleaded with him, but Braddock was firm, and made him halt on the road. Here he was left with a guard, and in the care of Dr. Craik, and here he had to stay for 2 long weeks. By that time he could move, but not without much pain, for he was still quite weak. It was his wish to join the troops in time for the great blow, and while yet too weak to mount his horse, he set off with his guards in a close cart, and reached Braddock's camp on the 8th of July. He was just in time, for the troops were to move on Fort Duquesne the next day. The fort was on the same side of the Monongahela as the camp, but twixt them lay a pass 2 miles in length, with the stream on the left and a high range of hills on the right. The plan was to ford the stream near the camp, march on the west bank of the stream for 5 miles or so, then cross to the east side and push on to the fort. By sunrise the next day the troops turned out in fine style, and marched off to the noise of the drum and fife. To Washington this was a great sight. Though still weak and ill, he rode his horse, and took his place on the staff as aide de camp. At 1 o'clock the whole force had crossed the ford north of the fort, and were on their way up the bank, when they were met by a fierce and sharp fire from foes they could not see. Wild war whoops and fierce yells rent the air. What Washington feared had come to pass. Braddock did his best to keep the troops in line, but as fast as they moved up, they were cut down by foes screened by rocks and trees. Now and then one of the red men would dart out of the woods with a wild yell to scalp a red coat who had been shot down. Wild fear seized Braddock's men, who fired and took no aim. Those in the front rank were killed by those in the rear. Some of the Virginia troops took post back of trees and fought as the red men did. Washington thought it would be a good plan for Braddock's men to do the same, but he thought there was but one way for troops to fight, and that brave men ought not to skulk in that way. When some of them took to the trees, Braddock stormed at them, and called them hard names, and struck them with the flat of his sword. All day long Washington rode here and there in the midst of the fight. He was in all parts of the field, a fine mark for the guns of the foe, and yet not a shot struck him to do him harm. 4 small shots went through his coat. 2 of his steeds were shot down, and though those who stood near him fell dead at his side, Washington had not one wound. The fight raged on. Death swept through the ranks of the redcoats. The men at the guns were seized with fright. Washington sprang from his horse, wheeled a brass field piece with his own hand, and sent a good shot through the woods. But this act did not bring the men back to their guns. Braddock was on the field the whole day, and did his best to turn the tide. But most of his headmen had been slain in his sight. 5 times he had been forced to mount a fresh horse, as one by one was struck down by the foeman's shot, and still he kept his ground and tried to check the flight of his men. At last a shot struck him in the right arm and went into his lungs. He fell from his horse and was borne from the field. The troops took fright at once, and most of them fled. The yells of the red men still rang in their ears. "All is lost!" they cried. "Braddock is killed!" Washington had been sent to a camp 40 miles off, and was on his way back when he heard the sad news. But Braddock did not die at once. He was brought back to camp, and for 2 days lay in a calm state, but full of pain. Now and then his lips would move, and he was heard to say, "Who would have thought it?" we shall know how to deal with them the next time. He died at Fort Necessity on the night of July 13th. Had he done as Washington told him, he might have saved his own life and won the day. But he was a proud man, and when he made up his mind to do a thing he would do it at all risks. Through this fault he missed the fame he hoped to win, lost his life, and found a grave in a strange land. His loss was a great gain to Washington, for all felt that he, so calm, so grave, so free from fear, was the right sort of man to lead troops to war. Those who had seen him in the field thought that he bore a charmed life, for though he stood where the shot fell thick and fast, he was not hurt and showed no signs of fear. But Washington was weak and in need of rest, and as the death of Braddock left him with no place in the force, he went back to Mount Vernon, where he thought to spend the rest of his days. The fight which he took part in as aide de camp, and which had so sad an end, goes by the name of Braddock's defeat. End of chapter 5.